Chapter 12, Education and School. I'm Cheryl Ferguson, and I'm going to be presenting today for this chapter. So, in Chapter 12, we're going to look at how American schools are structured. We'll do some work on why students succeed. We'll do some more work on why they drop out. We'll ask the question, what is the level of satisfaction for adolescents with their schooling? And what are the choices after high school? So, in the beginning, our schools were started by the Puritans. Uh, the Puritans started schools so that they could teach reading, so everyone could read the Bible themselves. As we moved along in time, beyond the schools that were rooted in religion or religious schools, we had some home schools where you would learn at your kitchen table. If you were rich enough, you could hire a tutor. And then oftentimes there were apprenticeships. So you would be set out to learn a trade with someone else. As far back as Thomas Jefferson, there was a movement for education for all. So that's one of those real core foundational beliefs of the United States. But it didn't always work that way. For example, in 1800, the average person spent 210 days in school, up to 1,050 days in school by 1900. High schools, when they started, were more like little colleges or private institutions. So in 1821, high schools were private. They did not allow minorities to come to school. They were very teacher centered in learning things so that it was all about educating that higher class of people who could afford to go to the high schools because you often had to pay to go to high school back in the 1800s. So there was a move to public schools where everyone could go. And that started in that industrial revolution period because we needed individuals who could go to factories and have those basic skills to work. And that basic skill focus is called a traditionalist view of learning. So you would go to school, you would learn to read, you would learn to write, you would learn arithmetic and those real core philosophies. However, John Dewey started thinking about schools beyond just teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. And he started a movement that we would call progressive. And with a progressive movement, it's not just reading and writing and arithmetic, it's about teaching students skills they need to be productive members of society, not just go to work in a factory, but to make their communities better. So that started to look at the reforming of society issues and that solving of social problems. You can see this in our schools because beyond reading, writing, arithmetic, history, we also teach things like drug prevention. So you've all probably had a DARE officer come into your classroom or a police officer come in and do some community service work. And that's that progressive piece where schools are not just teaching the basics, but are encouraging students to think about their community, to problem solve. And that transition also made it from less teacher centered to more student centered. When we had the space race happen and Sputnik was launched by the Russians, we realized that our educational system was behind the rest, well, at least Russia. So in 1950, they started looking at ways to include more science and math in our educational system. They've passed a series of laws. There's IDEA, which focuses on students with learning individual needs. and we passed No Child Left Behind. And now we have the Every Child, Every Student Succeeds Act. So our first structure was that elementary school that went from kindergarten to eighth grade. And then those high schools started to develop. The high schools where at the beginning you'd have to pay to go to them, and they were more like little colleges. And then we introduced that concept of public education so that everyone would have access to schools. And along that movement, there developed a concept of a junior high school, which is just what the name says. It's a high school with younger adolescents in it. So if we think of a high school where you have a different teacher for each of your subjects, where you move from room to room to room, where there is less time to socialize, where there is less time to build relationships with your teacher than you would have in an elementary school setting, that's what a junior high was. It was a high school structure for younger adolescents. But in the 1960s, we recognized that there were differences in adolescents' needs. A early adolescent needs different supports than a later adolescent. So William Alexander started to think about middle schools and suggested a middle school design. And it's not the same as a junior high school. So the junior highs were developed to prepare kids for high school. So they were meant to mirror high schools by having students change each class period. More recently, middle schools have been developed to try and meet the unique needs of those early adolescents. A problem that we're having is that those words junior high and middle school don't necessarily mean different things. Since there's no single agreed upon structure, you might have a school called a middle school, but it has a junior high structure in place, and vice versa. So if we're looking at that structure, some middle schools encompass grades 5 through 8, so fifth grade through eighth grade, and others have 6th through 7th, and some just have 7th and 8th. And if the initial goal of middle school was to be tailored to meet the needs of those early adolescents, again, many times there's not a difference between the two structures. And we know that the middle schoolers need more supports. So when they move up from elementary school to middle school, you often see something called a middle school slump. This term is used to describe the academic disengagement that many experience when they transition out of elementary school and into middle school or junior high. What we see is a decline in grades and a decline in the interest in the schools. The adolescents become less engaged in school activities, and they participate in fewer school activities than they did in elementary school. So this happens for a couple different reasons. First of all, we know that early adolescence is a fragile stage that can set the tone for academic achievement in high school and beyond. So it's kind of important that we look at this and figure out what we can do to support our adolescents. One of the things that adds to this middle school slump is that middle schools and junior highs are larger than elementary schools. There are more students, and they're exposed to a larger number of peers. And often they don't have that ability to have relationships with peers across classes. In other words, there are classes and they are in different classes each period with different students all day long. And this is different than what it looked like in elementary, where you may have been with the same 20 to 30 kids, but you were with them every day, all day, and you had that opportunity to develop close relationships with your peers. So beyond being impersonal with peers, it's impersonal with teachers. So, where you had time with your teacher, like all day, or if you were in a or if you were in an elementary where you might have like two sections, you'd have a teacher who did math and science and a teacher who did language arts. You'd only have those two teachers and that two classrooms to change to instead of five, six, or seven. So, having time with individual teachers or a small number of teachers helps you develop that relationship with your teacher and builds that connection to school. All of these factors add up and lead to that middle school slump, which is a concern. So, what makes a successful middle school? What is that difference in structure between junior high schools and middle schools? So, Jackson and Davis have identified several attributes of successful middle schools. First, successful middle schools have teachers who are specially trained to work with early adolescents. They're given opportunities to continue developing their skills so that they can focus in on that unique population. Successful middle schools have a rigorous and relevant curriculum. Although task mastery is to be emphasized, the material should be challenging, rigorous, and relevant to the students who are learning it. That relevant piece is somewhere between what they need to learn, what you think is important, and what's interesting to them. And that's a sweet spot and gets a lot of motivation and engagement if you can find that. We know that early adolescents are beginning to think abstractly and need to be challenged in order to be continually engaged in school. You really need to focus how it's relevant to them. So, another thing we need to do is be supportive and respectful. Explaining the importance of what they are learning is part of fostering a respectful atmosphere, showing them that their time is valuable. The adolescents still have a need for social support and feeling part of that community. So that supportive, respectful community is one of the things that make middle schools different than those high schools. And they need to be successful, not just in academics, but in other areas. We need to keep those parents involved. In any level of school, the level of parental involvement has a correlative effect on student achievement. We need to make sure that we're promoting success for all. And again, that goes back to it just doesn't have to be academic success. You should have those music programs, those sports programs should be introduced, and those community outreach programs where you're helping people in your community is important for a successful middle school. Again, this goes back to that progressive view of education where we're not just teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. We're teaching how to be an active member of our community. And that gives it relevant meaning to our young adolescents. And finally, we need to encourage healthy habits. We know that when we teach students of all kinds what they should eat, how much they should exercise, that encourages good healthy habits in everyone, which leads to healthier adults. We have a problem though, because oftentimes, even though schools are labeled middle schools, they're still keeping that structure that leads to that academic slump. Some current research shows that it would be better for early adolescents if school structure was returned to that K-8 paradigm. Our author cites Elmore, and who sees the opportunity to work with younger children changing the interaction patterns between adolescents and teachers. So having the younger students around makes the adolescents react differently to their teachers and to each other. Also, in this elementary structure where we have a smaller group of adolescents, a smaller amount of teachers, it gives more support in place. It keeps that support in place and provides opportunities for our early adolescents to be leaders by going down and helping the little kids. So while we have not as a nation moved back to this structure, it is definitely something we should be thinking about. So what makes an effective school? What we're going to look at makes is effective for both junior, senior highs, middle school, and actually we talk quite a bit about this in the elementary level. And this comes from Jackson and Davis's work. And they made these recommendations for middle schools, but again, they can be applied cross structures, cross school structures. The first thing was class size. Relatively small schools are best, but not too small. If you are too small, then you lose that opportunity to meet different people and to have activities like music and art and sports. If the classes are too small, they become too homogeneous and you're not exposed to enough um, diversity, either in activities or people. So ideally, a school should be less than 1,000. If you are at a relatively small school, you're given more opportunities to be involved. At larger schools, more students are left with fewer opportunities to be involved in sports and performing arts and things like that because the slots fill up because there are so many students. At a smaller school, you get to be and play on the football team because there are enough slots, spaces for students to fill for you to do both of those activities. Smaller schools feel less anonymous, so the teachers are more likely to know names and even more likely to know a little bit about the student themselves and their background. So building connections becomes easier and feels more authentic when you know your student's name and you know their older sister. And you might know that they're on the football team, where if you have a school that's huge and you're responsible for, 6 classes of 40 kids, you lose that personal relationship piece. Smaller schools also provide more supervision and support for faculty and staff. If your department has, you know, 10 teachers, it's harder to build close relationships with them than if your department has 4 teachers. Another thing that Jackson and Davis recommended was to look at that atmosphere. That atmosphere needs to make adolescents feel safe and important and encourage them to learn. Curriculum should be both relevant and challenging. School environment should foster a sense of personal responsibility. Students are more likely to be engaged if they feel responsible for their own learning. So our cute little cartoon here takes that teacher perspective back to a more traditionalist piece where it says, well, I put it out there. It's their job to learn it. And that type of atmosphere reduces engagement and learning outcomes. So if we think of a more progressive or a constructivist view of learning using that constructivism philosophy, we want students to have deep, rich conversations about the topics they're studying. We want them to help pick their activities by giving them choice. We want to make sure that they feel like they are in charge of their learning and that their instructors are just there to facilitate the learning. So that goes back to teacher behaviors. So if you are trying to facilitate learning, you are not having them all stay in their assigned seats, and you're not coming into the classroom really focused on, your personal issues. So that teacher behavior, how you treat the kids, is very important. And teachers need to be supportive of different academic strengths, provide feedback, encourage students by presenting material that is interesting and is relevant. So this again goes back to how middle school is a delicate time in adolescent's life. But if we look at these structures, schools can continue to improve and adequately support students. And again, these structures are effective both at the junior high and at the high school level, and often at the elementary level. So, how do the adolescents feel about school? The High School Survey of Student Engagement, or HSSSE, two-thirds of high school students reported being bored at least one time during the day. So, what do our students want? Our students want a curriculum that is engaging, relevant, allows them to be creative, is open for discussion and debate, and is challenging. And when we talk about curriculum and how the curriculum can foster those high levels of engagement, we have to think about the three different general, vocational, and college preparatory tracks of curriculum. So tracking is kind of controversial. And what tracking is when students are grouped by ability. And tracking fell completely out of favor in the 1980s and 1990s because it was seen to place students in a track because of race or their social economical status or other personal characteristics, for example, an IEP. And once you were placed in this track, it was believed to be hard to move from the lower track to the higher track, and that the lower tracks were less rigorous with their teaching. Dougal says that's that rich get richer and poor get poorer thinking that led to the tracking system falling out of favor. The strange thing about this is as we do newer research, we're finding, specifically by Melky and their colleagues, that there are some benefits to tracking. And surprisingly, the lower track students have more benefits than the higher track students. So those lower track students who are placed with peers on the same level end up having better self-esteem and greater academic gains. They don't have that feeling of competition with those higher kids. They're not always being shown to be lacking in their academic development because they're in a classroom with students who are the same level as they are so that they can blossom and grow, because it shifts it back to that mastery view of learning where I'm competing with myself instead of that peer competition piece where I have to be better than this student or I have to be better than that student. We also see that those higher level, those kids in that college preparatory track, they struggle more because when they were all in the same group, they were always, the high kid or the smart kid. But when you move into a track of kids where you're homogeneous and all on the same level, then you lose that piece of being smart. And their self-efficacy and their identity is damaged because they used to be smart and now they're not. So those three different types of curriculum would be the general curriculum, vocational, and then college preparatory. So college prep, That's where you're focusing on going on to college in my next step. I'm planning on going into community college and getting an associate's degree. I'm planning on going to a 4-year institution. So this track focuses on those higher math classes, making sure you have enough English and a foreign language to meet the requirements to get into college. Vocational track is where they teach you skills that you can use working. So a vocational track class might be shop. You might learn some woodworking. You might spend some time working with CAD programs. You might spend some time volunteering and working in a daycare center. So that vocational piece is that prepping to leave the school system, the educational system, and go to work. And then you have that general track, which are the kids who aren't really sure what they're going to do. And if you are in the general track, you are more likely to drop out. It is harder to reach that finish line of graduation. And they think this is because they're not as focused and they don't have an idea of what's going to happen next. But again, when we look at the curriculum and we're looking for high levels of engagement, what we are teaching needs to be relevant. They need to be able to see how they can apply it in their real world, in the real life. It needs to be creative. They need to be able to express themselves and use those higher level thinking skills that are developing to solve problems. And that whole discussion and debate piece where they're talking with their peers and solving problems together becomes very important when we're seeking high levels of engagement. And finally, a challenging curriculum. If it's not challenging, if you already know the stuff, you lose that relevant piece and you lose that engagement piece. So what happens when students aren't engaged in school? They drop out. So if we look at the map here of the United States, this map talks about the percentage of students that graduate high school. And you can see there's a pretty big spread. The figures are from 2016 and 2017. And you can see that an average of 85 students earn their high school diploma by the age of 25. So when we look at this, we're looking at those individuals who drop out and then later go back and get their GED. So we also know that nearly a third of students who enroll in high school in ninth grade, they drop out before finishing. Rates have gone up. And this particular figure looks at gender. So between 1940 and 2013, we went from 40% of our students, 45% of our students completing high school, all the way up to close to 90, over that 80 percentage mark. So this is encouraging. We can see that we are improving our retention and helping our students get to graduation. So why do they drop out? The causes of high school dropout are very complex. Most students who drop out probably experience more than one of these factors that we're going to discuss. Many experience others that we're not going to talk about because everyone has a unique experience. But we know, and research shows us, that school disengagement can begin as early as elementary school. So we're beginning to lose high school students as early as elementary school. Actually, factors from birth and infancy affect dropout rates too. Other studies have shown us that babies that are born premature, the babies with low birth weight, are at higher risk for dropping out of high school. Kids who have adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, are at a higher rate to drop out of high school. So when we think about dropping out, we're not just looking at what's happening in high school. We have to go back and we have to look at the whole picture of an individual's development. What do students say? Why do students say they're dropping out? They're dropping out because they're bored or they're alienated. These students report that classes are uninteresting and they don't see any relevance to their own personal lives. They also tend to have friends who aren't in school, so they feel disconnected from that school community because they don't have close relationships with peers. Who often feel that those awards are going to students who are higher achievers, so that those higher achieving students get more opportunities and more attention. And we have to make sure that we're limiting the feelings of boredom and alienation by providing that challenging, relevant curriculum and getting students to participate in activities and develop those peer ties to school too. Sometimes they drop out because of family responsibilities. Many report they need time to care for a family member or they must earn money to help the family out. Often it's their own child who they need to take care of and support. Teen moms and dads say they struggle with childcare or money for the baby. Responsive to this by offering daycare facilities at the high school. And you may have gone to a high school where this is available to our teen moms. And another big problem with this population is that teen moms are more likely to have another child. So all of these responsibilities, these family responsibilities, leads to dropping out. Truancy is a big problem. And truancy becomes a deadly cycle. So truancy is missing a lot of school with unexcused, right? And it's a symptom of that disengagement from school. And we know that if you don't go to school, you're going to experience academic failure. So you can be truant for several reasons. Sometimes your parent tells you it's okay and encourages you not to go to school. They might need you to stay home and watch a younger child, or they might need you to work. Another reason kids don't go to school is that they're just uninterested or unmotivated and they don't see the connection. But if you don't go to school and you're in the classroom, you fall behind. And as you fall behind, your grades get worse and it becomes harder and harder to go back to class, to go back to school. And that vicious cycle, I don't go to school, so I don't turn in my assignments, so I don't know what's going into class. So I don't know what's going into class, so I'm not going to go to class because I don't want to feel embarrassed. So I get further behind and don't know what's going on. That's a cycle that leads to them dropping out. And finally, you have those kids who have a low IQ. And those low IQ students may have many of these characteristics of dropping out. They may feel alienated because they don't have strong connections because of that peer, that mean girl peer piece where they see each other as not popular, like we talked about in the last chapter. Then that low IQ leads to that school failure. And if you're failing, why do you want to come to school? So you're feeling alienated. You may have had things that happened in early in infancy and prenatal and early childhood that leads to all of this. So we know that that IQ piece is another piece that makes kids drop out.